Episode 20, Civilizations in Decline. Question 1. Why had the Qing Empire and the Ottoman Empire not been colonized by the end of the 19th century? By the end of the 19th century, both the Qing and Ottoman empires had been gravely weakened by internal decay and Western encroachment, yet neither was fully colonized. Their survival owed less to strength than to a combination of geopolitical circumstance, limited reform, and rival imperial interests. The Qing Empire suffered humiliating defeats in the Opium Wars and conceded spheres of influence to Britain, France, Russia, and Japan. However, China's sheer size, population, and administrative inertia made outright colonization impractical. The Western powers preferred to exploit China through economic imperialism, unequal treaties, treaty ports, and extraterritorial privileges, rather than assume the costs of direct rule. Moreover, intense rivalry among the powers, Britain, France, Germany, Russia, and later Japan, prevented any single state from absorbing China entirely. Similarly, the Ottoman Empire, dubbed the sick man of Europe, survived through a precarious balance of power. Russia, Britain, France, and Austria all sought influence in the eastern Mediterranean, but feared that total Ottoman collapse would destabilize all of Europe. Britain, in particular, propped up the empire to block Russian expansion to the Suez Canal and India. The Ottomans themselves attempted defensive modernization, the Tanzimat reforms, westernized armies, and new bureaucratic institutions, which, though limited, staved off collapse. Thus, both empires endured not because they were strong, but because imperial competition made partition too dangerous and indirect control more profitable. The Qing and Ottomans survived the 19th century not by power, but by virtue of their hostage status in balance of power politics. Question 2. How did rivalries between European powers prolong the life of the Ottoman Empire? European rivalries played a decisive role in prolonging the life of the Ottoman Empire well beyond the point when its internal weaknesses might otherwise have led to collapse. By the 18th and 19th centuries, the Ottomans were militarily outdated, economically dependent, and administratively incompetent, often referred to as the sick man of Europe. Yet the empire's strategic location at the crossroads of Europe, Asia, and Africa made it vital to the balance of power. No single European state could allow its rivals to dominate Ottoman territory. Russia in particular sought to expand south towards the Black Sea, the Balkans, and eventually the Mediterranean, aiming for warm water ports and influence over Orthodox Christians under Ottoman rule. Britain and France, however, saw Russian expansion as a direct threat to their own interests, especially the Suez region and the trade routes to India. Austria, too, feared that Russian gains in southeastern Europe would destabilize their multi-ethnic empire. Because each state's ambitions conflicted with the others, they often intervened to preserve the Ottoman Empire as a buffer. The Crimean War from 1853 to 1856 is the clearest example of this. Britain and France fought alongside the Ottomans to halt Russian advances. Even as European powers stripped away Ottoman territory, none wanted its total disintegration. Thus, the empire endured not through internal strength, but through external competition. The Eastern question, how to manage Ottoman decline without upsetting Europe's equilibrium, remained unresolved for over a century, ensuring that the Ottomans survived as a geopolitical necessity rather than a sovereign power. Question 3. What were the Tanzimat reforms? What were the parallels between the Tanzimat reforms and Peter the Great's efforts at modernizing Russia? The Tanzimat reforms, introduced in the Ottoman Empire between 1839 and 1876, were a series of government initiatives aimed at modernizing and centralizing the state in response to internal decline and growing European pressure. The term Tanzimat means reorganization, and the reforms sought to strengthen imperial authority, modernize the military, and rationalize administration to prevent further disintegration of the empire. Beginning with the Hat-i-Sharif of Gulhan in 1839 and followed by the Hat-i-Humayun in 1856, the reforms promised equality before the law for all subjects, Muslims and non-Muslims alike, modernized taxation, created secular courts, and restructured the bureaucracy along Western lines. New schools and legal codes modeled on European systems were established, and the army was reorganized with modern training and equipment. These reforms were meant to preserve, not dismantle, the Ottoman state, modernization without Western domination. The Tanzimat period closely parallels Peter the Great's efforts to modernize Russia in the early 18th century. Both were top down reforms imposed by autocratic rulers seeking to strengthen the state by adopting Western methods while retaining political control. Like Peter, the Ottoman reformers aimed to build a modern army, efficient bureaucracy, and rationalized economy to compete with Europe. However, in both cases, modernization remained largely superficial. The reforms improved administration and military effectiveness, but did not fundamentally transform social hierarchies or political culture. In the Ottoman case, as in Russia's, modernization served the survival of autocracy rather than the creation of liberal or democratic institutions. Question 4. How does Murad's response to Napoleon's 1798 invasion of Egypt illustrate a larger problem in the Muslim world? Murad Bey's response to Napoleon's 1798 invasion of Egypt revealed a deeper crisis that characterized much of the Muslim world in the late 18th and early 19th century: the widening technological and organizational gap between Islamic states and industrializing Europe. When the French army, equipped with modern artillery, disciplined infantry, and scientific expertise, landed in Egypt, Murad's Mamluk cavalry confronted them with traditional tactics that had changed little in centuries. Armed with bravery and experience, but not much else, the Mamluks were easily defeated at the Battle of the Pyramids, their charges rendered useless against French firepower and formation. This defeat symbolized more than a military failure. It exposed the inability of traditional Muslim elites to comprehend or adapt to the new realities of warfare, administration, and science. The Mamluks, like many ruling classes across the Islamic world, relied on personal valor and decentralized power structures rather than disciplined, bureaucratic, or technologically advanced systems. Napoleon's easy victory in Egypt thus became a wake-up call for the Muslim world. It demonstrated that Europe's strength came not only from weaponry, but from systemic modernization, education, science, and centralized administration, areas in which the Islamic empires had stagnated. Murad's defeat, therefore, marked the symbolic beginning of the Muslim world's painful confrontation with the Western world. Question 5. Compare the reforms of Muhammad Ali in Egypt with the Tanzimat reforms. Why were the reforms not enough to truly modernize Egypt? Muhammad Ali's reforms in early 19th century Egypt and the Tanzimat reforms in the Ottoman Empire shared similar goals. Both sought to modernize their societies to strengthen the state, resist European domination, and revive Islamic power. Muhammad Ali, ruling from 1805 to 1848, introduced sweeping military, economic, and administrative reforms. He created a conscript army modeled on European forces, established state monopolies over agriculture and industry, built schools for technical and military training, and centralized taxation and administration. Likewise, the Tanzimat reforms in the Ottoman Empire aimed to modernize the bureaucracy, codify laws, expand education, and promote equality among subjects to preserve imperial unity. However, Both efforts failed to achieve full modernization because they were imposed from above and lacked the social and institutional foundations to sustain them. In Egypt, economic modernization depended heavily on forced labor and foreign loans, creating resentment and debt. Industrial and military reforms collapsed under the strain of European intervention, particularly British dominance after 1882. In both Egypt and the Ottoman Empire, modernization meant adopting European techniques without the accompanying political liberalization, industrial base, or cultural transformation. These reforms strengthened the state temporarily, but left their societies dependent, autocratic, and vulnerable to Western control. Question 6. Describe the rise of the Mahdi. How might the nature of the Mahdist state and its eventual defeat set a precedent for Islam in the Middle East? The rise of the Mahdi in the late 19th century reflected both religious fervor and political resistance to imperial domination in the Muslim world. In 1881, Muhammad Ahmad, a religious leader in Sudan, declared himself the Mahdi, the divinely guided one expected to restore justice and purify Islam. His message infused religious devotion with anti imperial nationalism, attracting followers disillusioned with Egyptian rule, itself backed by the British, and with the corruption of local elites. Within a few years, his movement defeated Egyptian and British forces, capturing Khartoum in 1885 and killing General Charles Gordon. The Mahdist state that followed sought to create a theocratic Islamic order grounded in strict religious discipline and rejection of Western influence. However, the Mahdist regime soon faced internal divisions, economic collapse, and external pressure from the British, who reconquered Sudan in 1898 under General Kitchener. Its defeat symbolized the limits of purely religious resistance against industrialized imperial power. Yet the Mahdist uprising set a precedent for modern Islamic movements. It demonstrated how religious revivalism could mobilize mass support against foreign domination and corrupt local rule. The Mahdi's legacy lived on as both a warning and an inspiration, showing that spiritual zeal alone could not sustain a modern state, but also that Islam could serve as a powerful force of unity and resistance. This dual legacy, faith as both a rallying cry and a political challenge to imperialism, would shape Islamic reform and resistance movements across the Middle East in the 20th century. Question 7. Why did the Qing dynasty start to crumble by the late 19th century? By the late 19th century, the Qing dynasty was crumbling under the combined weight of internal decay and external pressures. Internally, the population growth outstripped resources, leading to widespread poverty, famine, and social unrest. The bureaucratic system, once a pillar of stability, became paralyzed by corruption and inefficiency. The devastating Taiping Rebellion from 1850 to 1864 and subsequent uprisings such as the Boxer Rebellion drained the treasury, weakened the military, and eroded public confidence in the dynasty's ability to rule. Externally, the Qing faced relentless humiliation at the hands of the Western powers and Japan. Defeat in the Opium Wars, 1839 to 1842, and then again in 1856 to 1860, forced China to sign unequal treaties, cede ports and territories, and allow foreign spheres of influence. The Sino-Japanese War, 1894 to 1895, further exposed China's weaknesses when Japan, once seen as a tributary state, emerged as a modern imperial power. Attempts at reform, such as the self-strengthening movement and the Hundred Days Reform, faltered because conservative officials feared losing their privileges. By century's end, the Qing state was caught between an outdated imperial system and a rapidly modernizing world. Its inability to adapt politically, economically, or militarily left it vulnerable, setting the stage for revolution and the eventual collapse of imperial rule in 1911. Question 8. China had always endured dynastic collapse. Why would the collapse of the Qing dynasty be the last? The collapse of the Qing dynasty in 1911 proved to be China's last dynastic fall because the conditions that had sustained the dynastic cycle for 2 millennia had fundamentally changed. In earlier eras, dynasties collapsed when they lost the mandate of heaven, but a new ruling house, often militarily strong, politically capable, and culturally legitimate, would rise from within the traditional imperial framework to replace it. The political, social, and intellectual foundations that made this renewal possible no longer existed by the late 19th century. First, foreign imperialism shattered the idea that China was the central power in East Asia. Defeat by Western powers and Japan exposed the Qing as incapable of defending the realm, not only undermining one dynasty's legitimacy, but the entire imperial system. No Chinese group could plausibly claim the mandate of heaven when the state itself could not protect its sovereignty. Second, the spread of new ideologies, nationalism, republicanism, socialism, eroded faith in monarchy altogether. Reformers and revolutionaries alike argued that China needed a modern nation state, not another imperial household. Finally, the decentralization of military power meant that no single contender could reunify the country under a new dynasty. Warlords, not dynasts, filled the power vacuum. Thus, when the Qing fell, the dynastic cycle ended not with replacement, but with rejection. The old system proved unrevivable in a modern, globalized world. Question 9. What was the Opium War about? How does it exemplify the impact of the Industrial Revolution on what had previously been an impervious pattern of interaction between Europe and China? The Opium War from 1839 to 1842 was, on the surface, a conflict over Britain's illegal opium trade in China. But at a deeper level, it was a clash between two fundamentally different world systems, and the moment when the Industrial Revolution shattered the centuries old pattern in which China dictated the terms of interaction with Europe. For centuries, China had maintained strict control over foreign trade, confining Europeans to Canton and limiting what they could buy or sell. Britain, however, faced a major trade imbalance. It wanted Chinese tea, silk, and porcelain, but China wanted almost nothing from Britain. To fix this deficit, British merchants began smuggling Indian opium into China, creating widespread addiction and draining Chinese silver reserves. When the Qing government finally acted, seizing opium stocks and banning trade, Britain responded with military force. Here is where the Industrial Revolution changed everything. China had long assumed technological and military superiority, but British steamships, modern artillery, mass produced rifles, and industrial era logistics rendered Chinese defenses obsolete. The Qing Navy, still reliant on wooden sailing junks, was helpless against iron hulled gunboats. British troops could be resupplied globally. China's forces could barely coordinate regionally. The resulting Treaty of Nanjing forced China to open treaty ports, cede Hong Kong, pay massive indemnities, and accept extraterritoriality, unprecedented infringements on its sovereignty. This marked the beginning of the century of humiliation, in which industrialized powers imposed their will on the Chinese through unequal treaties. Thus, the Opium War exemplifies how industrialization upended old diplomatic norms. What had once been a relationship managed on Chinese terms became one defined by Western firepower and global capitalism. The war revealed that industrial modernity, not imperial tradition, now dictated geopolitical power, and China, for the first time in its long history, found itself unable to control the terms of engagement. Question 10. In what ways did the Taiping Rebellion foreshadow the collapse of Imperial China? The Taiping Rebellion, 1850 to 1864, foreshadowed the collapse of Imperial China by exposing fundamental weaknesses in the Qing dynasty's social, political, and military structures. First, it revealed the Qing government's inability to effectively manage internal crises. The rebellion spread across southern and central China for more than a decade, demonstrating that the state lacked both the administrative capacity and military strength to quell large scale uprisings without relying on regional armies. This reliance empowered regional leaders like Zhang Gufan, accelerating the decentralization of authority and weakening the dynasty's control. Second, the rebellion highlighted deep social grievances. Massive population growth, land shortages, rural poverty, and corruption fueled support for radical alternatives to Qing rule. These same unresolved pressures would later drive the Boxer Rebellion, regional militarism, and finally the 1911 revolution. Third, the Taiping challenged the ideological foundations of the Qing. Its blend of Christian millenarianism, anti Manchu nationalism, and calls for sweeping social reforms such as gender equality, land redistribution, and the abolition of Confucian traditions showed that the dynasty had lost the confidence of many of its subjects. Finally, the enormous destruction and loss of life weakened China's economy and military, making the empire more vulnerable to foreign encroachment. These long term consequences set the stage for the Qing collapse in 1911. Question 11. What role did nationalism play in the collapse of the Qing dynasty? Nationalism played a critical role in the collapse of the Qing dynasty by undermining its legitimacy and fueling revolutionary movements that challenged imperial rule. By the late 19th century, many educated Chinese increasingly viewed the Qing, an ethnic Manchu dynasty, as foreign occupiers who had failed to defend China against Western imperialism and Japanese expansion. The humiliating defeats in the Opium Wars, the Sino French War, and especially the 1895 loss to Japan intensified public anger and the desire to save China through radical change. Reformist and revolutionary groups drew heavily on nationalist ideas. The self strengthening movement and the Hundred Days Reform attempted to modernize China while preserving the dynasty, but conservatives blocked any meaningful change, deepening disillusionment. Meanwhile, Sun Yat sen and the Tongmenghui promoted Han nationalism and the creation of a unified modern republic. Their message resonated with students, urban intellectuals, overseas Chinese, and members of newly formed modern armies. Nationalism also contributed to the fragmentation of imperial authority. Provincial leaders increasingly acted in the name of protecting the nation rather than the dynasty. When the 1911 Wu Chang uprising began, nationalist sentiment deprived the Qing of public loyalty and empowered the republican movement that ended 2,000 years of imperial rule.